Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, February 6th, 2023. And if you're like me, you've probably seen an endless stream of reporting and warnings and commentary and social media posts about the big red, well, it's not even red. I just like calling it a big red balloon, but the big surveillance balloon. I mean, there was this dramatic shoot down by military jets. That was the icing on the cake. This is a big show recently. So on this episode, I want to talk about how I see this as exposing a much, much bigger problem than potential surveillance by a foreign power. And yes, a bigger problem does include our own massive surveillance state, and I'm going to go through some of the lowlights of that. But there's an even bigger problem underlying all of it. And for that, at the end, I've got some insight from people like Thomas Paine, James Madison, even a little John Adams, possibly. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello, a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the mainstream platforms, the live stream notifications don't go out as fast as we'd like. I want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. There's Haji, there's Dixie Strong in Bama, Tim Martin in Arizona, Kirk Morrison, hope you're doing well, in South Carolina, Cheriton Farmer, Missouri, Alt Reality, Sharon Patriot, Clay Kent, Burnin' Rubber, M. Gabriel, Ragnar, Richard Banks, GTA, oh, good to see you, and everyone else. Larry Clark, Murray Ray in Michigan. I appreciate you all being here. I should mention that if you want to follow along with the articles and other episodes and original source documents, I've got a few of those as well that I'm going to be mentioning in this show. You do have to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty for at least ease of access. Every episode, I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. And in that blog post, you'll find a section that says show links, and that's where I include the stuff that I mention in each episode. Anyways, I do want to get right to this. So again, the link is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now, I'm not going to talk about the balloon itself, whether it's a surveillance tool or weather gathering tool or for research or which government is lying, because I actually see all governments as lying. And while we've been inundated, everyone talking about this and talking about which approach is right or who's dumb, all this stuff. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we've got a bit of our own surveillance problem right here at home that seems to be almost totally ignored, as if the day-to-day surveillance 24/7, 365 at every level isn't a problem or something. I don't know. So I want to just go through a few of the highlights or lowlights. And this isn't going to be the big problem, the underlying problem that I want to mention being exposed. But let's start out with the NSA. This is part of the big problem. And I did an episode on this, many episodes, but some people seem to think that the Patriot Act expired in the last couple of years, and the NSA is now just back to protecting us from foreign threats. I know it's probably not you thinking that, but there are some idiots out there. But there's much more to the Patriot Act that's actually permanent. It's not just the Call Detail Records Program, Section 215. In fact, about 90% of the Patriot Act is permanent. It never had a sunset. In that episode, I covered Patriot Act on steroids, surveillance state beyond Section 215, almost, going on 4 years at some point this year, back in 2019. I will link to that episode in the show notes. Basically, the overview, we're talking about things like fusion centers, information sharing, national security letters, enhanced screening at the TSA, facial recognition. They all come from the Patriot Act and its successor. So we do want to get a good grasp of what we're facing. Justin Amash actually had a pretty good tweet about this as well just the other day. He said, contrary to popular belief, the Patriot Act didn't expire in 2020. 3 provisions expired, 3, and about 90% of it never will ever expire. It's all written as permanent. Rest assured, Justin writes, other provisions are still being used daily to violate your rights. Don't be distracted, really. Don't be distracted. And he was highlighting Section 702 of FISA. Now, I covered Section 702 and Executive Order EO 12333. They call it 12333 or just 333. In a couple of episodes on how they're doing so much surveillance, they could shut down the entirety of the Patriot Act, and they're still going to be surveilling everyone all the time. They like having different ways to be able to do this or under the law. So in case there's a court case on one supposed legal authorization, they've got another one. They'll just say, oh, no, we're just doing it under this. So first episode that I want to mention is Like a Cancer, Warrantless Surveillance under Section 702. I covered that in some detail. And then this other one, Don't Believe Reports Claiming NSA Surveillance was shut down, because we got a lot of that in recent years because they were letting parts of it expire. But Marcy Wheeler, who does so much great work on the surveillance state, she made a really great point about this. And I think this is really the important summary when it comes to federal surveillance. She says, the NSA almost never gives up a function they like. The NSA loves to collect all data on everyone, all the time, everywhere on Earth, whatever you're doing, wherever you're going. They want to get as much information on people as possible. And then they want to share that information so other law enforcement agencies, other government agencies can use it against you. Or, well, they'll wash their hands. They're just collecting the data. Of course, they have these massive data centers. Bluffdale, Utah, San Antonio, Texas is even larger. And they're expanding the main one in Maryland. It's a huge amount of information that they're collecting. So they now almost never give up a function they like. Instead, they make sure that they don't have any adverse court rulings telling them they've broken the law, and they move the function to someplace else. So maybe they don't need as much called CDR program under Section 215 because they're accessing all the same data that bounces around the world through international cables and things like that under Section 702, or they use Executive Order 12333. And that's what William Binney, who's the former NSA technical chief, told ARS Technica. He said this program, again, EO 12333, was started at least back in 2001 and has expanded to between 80 and 100 tap points on the fiber optic lines in the lower 48 states. This means that the primary target of this collection is domestic. Most collection of U.S. domestic communications and data is done under EO 12333. So even if they totally got rid of the Patriot Act, which they won't, they don't want to, they are still doing all of this under another so-called legal authorization, this time just an executive order. Section 2.3, paragraph C in the upstream program. So basically he's saying, at least as of a few years ago, 80% or most of the collection of U.S. domestic surveillance done by the NSA, which is illegal for them to do it. Domestic surveillance, just like the CIA, it's illegal for them to do that as well. They do it anyways. And now we learn in recent weeks that the CIA and the NSA have been collaborating with the FBI, and the FBI now, it's just out there that they are working together to do illegal, warrantless domestic surveillance they were never supposed to do. Here's how former Judge Andrew Napolitano put it in a recent column. He said the FBI admission that it uses the CIA and the NSA to spy for it came in the form of a 906-page FBI rulebook that was released, and it was written during the previous administration, and it was given to federal agents in 2021 and made known to Congress just this last month. He said the CIA charter prohibits its employees from engaging in domestic surveillance and law enforcement. Yet we know the CIA is present physically or virtually in all the 50 U.S. state houses. The NSA, he goes on, is required to go to the FISA court when it wants to spy. We know that this, too, is a charade, as the NSA regularly captures every keystroke triggered on every mobile device and every desktop computer in the U.S. 24/7 without warrants. And now what they'll say is, well, we've got some kind of a warrant. It's a FISA warrant, a secret court. It doesn't describe, well, here's the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. An unreasonable search and seizure is one that does not follow this standard. And no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Anything that just searches anyone and everyone in a given area, geographic area, for using everyone who has a phone. This is what the founding generation called a general warrant. They wanted everything to be very specific. If you're going to search persons' stuff, their papers, their houses, their persons, You have to have a warrant on probable cause of a crime, so no one's going to be searched or harassed unless there is probable cause that that person committed a crime. There's an oath or affirmation backing that up, and it describes everything in details, particularly describes the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. It is impossible to do broad-based warrantless surveillance or broad-based mass surveillance under the standard of the Fourth Amendment. So all the mass surveillance tools that exist, all of them automatically violate the Fourth Amendment. And we know, well, yesterday was James Otis Jr.'s birthday, and we can often call him the founding father of the Fourth Amendment because the beginning of the American Revolution, as if you've been watching or listening to this show for a while, I've been highlighting this quite a bit. We know that the beginning of the American Revolution, the real American Revolution, was a radical change in the views of the people. It happened for years before the War for Independence. And the beginning of the revolution kicked off with James Otis Jr.'s great speech against the writs of assistance. And the writs of assistance, over multi-hour debates and a speech, James Otis argued that they were general warrants. They were illegal, and the only legal warrants were special warrants to search houses or places specially named. This is his view, was a precursor to what became the Fourth Amendment. George Mason also included this. Now, of course, Mason's language in the Virginia Declaration of Rights heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson's writing in the Declaration of Independence. But here's from Section 10 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, that general warrants, whereby an officer or messenger may be commanded to search suspected places without evidence of a fact committed, or to seize any person or persons not named, or whose offense is not particularly described and supported by evidence, are grievous and oppressive to do this, and ought not to be granted. Now, it wasn't a strict prohibition as they included in the Fourth Amendment, but to call these kind of broad-based searches, oh, you just happen to be driving down a freeway, so they got to keep track of where you are, take pictures of who's in your car, keep track of that as well, scan your license plate, monitor where you are through your phone, etc., etc. None of these are particularly describing any particular potential crime. There's no probable cause. There's no nothing. You happen to exist, and so therefore government is going to track and trace you to supposedly protect you. Now, we're railing on the feds here, and I'm just going through this very quickly. Some of the, like I said, the lowlights of the federal surveillance. We know that the NSA is collecting data, spying on people domestically, illegally, violating the Fourth Amendment. The CIA is doing it. The FBI partners with them. They all do it together. But it's not just the feds. It's literally everyone. And I covered in an episode a few years ago the top 7 ways they spy on you. A lot of it I focused on some of the local surveillance here. I will link to that again in the show notes. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Haji says James Otis Jr. may have been the founding father of the American Revolution. Well, he certainly kicked it off. He, Patrick Henry, a few others really lit the spark underneath that radical change in the viewpoint of the people. To view these general warrants as illegal, as an attack on their liberty, or as Patrick Henry said, you're not bound to yield obedience to a far-off government that enacts stuff that they're not even authorized to do in the first place. It's a line in the sand. It's a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Or James Otis Jr. in that same 1761 speech told us that an act against the Constitution is void. Because if government is no longer supreme, government doesn't hold final authority over itself, something else does. Whether it's a written or an unwritten Constitution, if the people are at the top of the food chain, the people are the fountain of all power. The source of all power, as George Mason, Mercy Otis Warren, and so many other people told us, then government can only do what they're authorized to do, and it isn't up to government to tell the people if the government violated the Constitution of the people for the government. So that's a quick side note. That's an important point. I appreciate you making that, Haji, as well. So it's not just the feds doing the spying. A lot of it is on a local level as well. But some people are foolish enough, I'll just say they're dumb enough to think that we need some kind of a federal law or federal court case to stop the states and localities from violating our rights as well. When it comes to surveillance, it's the feds that are funding most of this stuff on a local level in the first place. As early as 2015, probably earlier as well, we were reporting on federal programs that give surveillance gear to state and local law enforcement. Sometimes it's a direct handout of equipment to spy on people. Sometimes it's in the form of grants to protect us from terrorists or drug dealers or whatever. Basically to ramp up the police state, always to protect you from something you're scared of, but really to violate your rights and to control you. Never forget, for your safety really means so we can control you when it comes from government. Here's from Mike Meharry. This is an article maybe in 2015 or so. Under the agreements inked with the Feds, so the Feds hand out money or surveillance equipment to state and local law enforcement. Oftentimes it's just directly to them. And then they have these things called MOUs or MOAs, Memorandum of Agreement, Memorandum of Understanding. We see this in the gun control realm as well. The ATF makes agreements with virtually every local law enforcement agency out there to help the ATF to act as federal agents. But anyways, under these agreements inked with the Feds, local and state law enforcement agencies must not disclose information about the technology or operating manuals without FBI approval. So if the FBI approves, for example, a cell site simulator device, they hand it to local law enforcement. Law enforcement uses this device. A cell site simulator does what the name says. It simulates a cell phone tower, and it tricks every phone within the range of the simulator into first connecting to the simulator so they can quick download and get all that information. There used to be these 10-inch by 4-inch little technology boxes. Like if you've ever seen an audio input device for a computer for microphones or things like that. It's something like that, like a rack mount device. Now it's mostly PC or computer based. They just collect all the information. They pass the signal off seamlessly to the actual cell site, and you don't even know. There's no old school clicking or tapping where you can say I know they're on there listening. No, they're just downloading all the information. They probably have algorithms that sort through stuff, etc. But if the feds authorize a sale or a transfer or a handout of equipment or money to get this equipment to local law enforcement, the FBI requires them to sign these non-disclosure agreements or memorandums of agreement with the FBI saying they're not going to talk about it at all. And Mike writes, on top of that, local and state law enforcement are forbidden from describing the technology, the software, or other related material during pre-trial court hearings, in search warrants, or even upon court-ordered disclosure unless the FBI approves. So basically, they've been told, we've seen some documentation where local law enforcement, if they get busted using this stuff, violating warrant requirements on a state level as well, because we know that every state has their own constitution that everyone seems to ignore. If there's some discovery that points to this, they would rather just drop the case back down and lose it rather than give up the information on how they're spying on everybody. Here again from Mike Meharry. Now, some of the stuff we know that's being handed out, I should mention, it's the phone surveillance. It's the cell site simulators that I'm mentioning. There's also geolocation tracking tools. There's more military-grade surveillance tool. We've got drones. There's also the facial recognition. There's automated license plate readers that can snap pictures pretty accurately of up to 8 to 1,000 just in moments. They're so fast. They may get a few wrong here and there, but it's not really an accuracy problem that we're concerned with. Here Mike writes again, he said, state and local law enforcement agencies often obtain these expensive spy gadgets through federal grants and other federal funding sources that remain off the books. They're ripping us off. If you think about it, this is what Thomas Paine warned about in Common Sense. When we suffer under our own government, we also have to be reminded of the fact that we furnish the means by which we suffer. They're robbing us. They're stealing our money. They're devaluing it through the printing press as well, as a quick side note. And then they're using the fruits of our own labors to oppress us, to control us, to monitor us, to track us. And even if you are okay with how they use that information today, I don't think it takes too great of an imagination to think of how someone you absolutely despise could use a total digital profile against you at some point in the future. I mean, social credit score, I think, is going to be very, very moderate in compared to what they could do. Anyways, Mike says, in other words, state and local law enforcement can purchase or get this high-tech surveillance equipment without any local government or any local public oversight whatsoever. In fact, city councils, County governments and mayors may not even know police have obtained the equipment, and oftentimes once they find out, as Mike learned in his lawsuit against surveillance by the Lexington Police Department, Lexington government, what we often learn is it doesn't matter. As soon as they find out, they're just on board with whatever the police state tells them they need to be. Can't really offend that thin blue line. Then now, once they have all the tools, if you think about it, you've got the feds doing all this surveillance. The FBI collaborates with the CIA and the NSA. Then they take all the money and the gear, they hand it to local law enforcement, they get them to do surveillance. Well, why? Because they want them to share the information. Now, the NSA doesn't have people on the ground doing this kind of granular local surveillance. Of course, we know they're scooping up all kinds of data, but being able to use a cell site simulator or a drone or facial recognition, you really need kind of infrastructure on the ground. So they hand that all off, and then the locals are expected to share all that information, or it's just kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I don't even know if it's part of an official agreement, but they end up sharing all this information back upstream with the feds and basically any other law enforcement agency, government agency in the country through things called fusion centers, or ISE, which is Information Sharing Environment, which is another Patriot Act era item. And Mike puts it this way: the feds can share and tap into vast amounts of information gathered at the state and local level through fusion centers and a system known as Information Sharing Environment, or ISE. And fusion centers are actually part of that ISE. There's about 70 of them in the country. They're not everywhere, but they certainly exist, and these are funded by states, but they're partnerships with the feds. They're tools to actually facilitate data sharing of warrantless surveillance. And that's really the best way to describe it. Mike says ISE serves as a conduit for the sharing of information gathered without a warrant. Known ISE partners include the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which oversees 17 federal agencies and organizations, including the NSA. So whatever the local surveillance people are doing, they hand this off into the fusion centers and ISE, and that goes back to the NSA, and I'm sure they're just building bigger and bigger data profiles, more granular, more detailed on anyone and everyone. ISE then utilizes these partnerships to collect and share data on the millions of unwitting people they track. We know, for example, just on the license plate reader system, Electronic Frontier Foundation did a survey of just 200 and some law enforcement agencies around the country, state, local, and federal. And just out of those 200, over a 2-year period, they did 2.5 billion location scans of license plates. 2.5 billion. And can you imagine how bad it's going to be? They don't even need to have the cameras around once a pilot program here in California is a digital license plate. This is just getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And I told you I wanted to focus on an underlying problem of the big balloon, the surveillance balloon. Of course, I can do a little whataboutism. Like, okay, yeah, maybe they're doing some surveillance, but these guys are worse. And it all sucks. All these governments are evil. But as I mentioned at the start today, I think it's exposing an even bigger problem. And I had to put together a few notes here to kind of go through my thought process on this. And it basically goes like this. Despite the fact that we're being spied on the feds every second of every day, despite the fact that it's illegal, it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, despite the fact that the American Revolution, really the revolution in thought, started with an opposition to mass warrantless surveillance, this general warrant process, despite the fact that it's not just the feds, but it's every level of government in every single state, local, and federal. They're all in on it together, despite the fact that the feds are basically paying your state to spy on you and share it with the feds, despite the fact that your state absolutely participates, and so does basically every law enforcement agency out there, and despite the fact that we don't even know all the ways that they actually track us. We often find out about this stuff years later. The license plate tracking program, we only even learned about it. We only got a glimpse of how it was being used on a federal level in partnership with the states after it had been running for 8 years. And despite the fact we don't even know what they've been doing or what they have planned in the future, all the attention and talk and concern goes to the balloon. Something that ended up getting eliminated in mere seconds. So all this focus goes on that, instead of focusing on the real threat to our lives and liberty. And now that the balloon is obliterated, people can then go back to what they do, which is the important work of choosing which team will protect them from the next balloon. And this is absolute absurdity in my book, in my opinion. And I think Thomas Paine gives us some good insight. Let me pull this up here. He said, as a pretense for a large standing army, the danger of a foreign invasion must be bellowed forth from the pulpit, from the press, and by their public orators. Or here's James Madison. Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. And I don't have it up on the screen, but if you're watching, I'm wearing the t-shirt, the great John Adams quote. I would just remove one word. Fear is the foundation of most governments. Just remove the word most, and you've got this absolutely correct. But people are living in fear of the balloon. They're living in the fear of this foreign enemy, and maybe they're okay with their domestic tyrants. I'm not sure. But I think this is important to keep reminding people. It's whether you want to call it whataboutism or just ignoring one threat because one's worse, I don't know. But I think the greatest threat to our lives, our liberty, our privacy, our security, our safety, our prosperity comes right from our own government. And as Thomas Paine told us, that means we furnish the means by which we suffer. And I want to get that kind of message out to more and more people. We work very hard to get that out to more people every single day. Nothing helps us get this kind of work done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month if you believe in our work and you want to help us reach and teach more people. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And while I'm mentioning that, I do want to take a quick moment. I haven't done this for a little while, but I want to just say a quick thank you, a huge one, to just a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. There's Donald in South Carolina, Anthony right here in California, Michelle in Illinois, Stephen in Tennessee, Audrey in Missouri, Jack in Michigan, and Milo in New Hampshire. Pretty awesome. If you didn't see my Friday Nullification Movement news, I was focusing heavily on nullification efforts and a new nullification caucus in New Hampshire, which is pretty cool. So make sure to check that out as well. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope more important than anything, it made you think and maybe you learned something. I don't have extra time today to look through any time to look through the live chat right now. I do see Bell Liberty pointing out that I believe it was nothing more than a distraction, and I agree with that as well. They don't care about our rights, especially the press, but the press and the media, they love the clicks. And if there weren't tens of millions of people who were more concerned about the balloon than all the surveillance that I was talking about in this episode, I think the greatest underlying problem is people just continually ignore the greatest threat to our liberty, and that is our own government. And they're just worried about who runs that government and who's going to oppress them. They're okay with it as long as it's their team, and they hate it when it's the other team. And that, I think, is the big underlying problem, that unless it changes, things are just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. Anyways, I hope you found this interesting. Again, I hope you learned something. I hope you had a great weekend. Your Monday's off to a good start. And 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I appreciate you being here and hope to see you next time on the path to liberty.